In 2018, neuroscientist Anil Seth stood before a packed auditorium at the Royal Institution and declared something that would have sounded absurd to scientists just decades earlier. Your sense of self is a controlled hallucination generated by your brain. The research emerging from laboratories at Stanford, MIT, and the Max Planck Institute is converging on a conclusion that Buddhist masters have taught for 25 centuries. There is no solid, unchanging self at the core of your being. No permanent ego witnessing your experiences. What you call I is a fluid process, a construction assembled moment by moment from neural activity, sensory input, memory, and prediction. If you're ready to explore how cutting-edge neuroscience validates ancient Buddhist wisdom about the nature of self, if you want to understand what this means for your actual experience of being alive, then subscribe now and activate notifications, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you relate to your own mind. The Buddha's teaching on Anatman, often translated as no self or non-self, stands as one of the most radical and misunderstood concepts in spiritual philosophy. When Siddhartha Gautama sat under the Bodhi tree and examined the components of his experience with unwavering attention, he made a discovery that contradicted everything his culture assumed about human nature. He found no unchanging essence, no eternal soul, no permanent witness at the center of consciousness. Instead, he observed 5 aggregates, what Buddhist philosophy calls the skandhas: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness itself. These 5 processes arise together, interact, create the appearance of a unified self, but when examined closely, none of them contains anything permanent or independently existing. This wasn't mystical revelation. It was empirical observation conducted through the laboratory of meditation. And now, 25 centuries later, neuroscience has developed tools sophisticated enough to peer inside the living brain and confirm what contemplatives discovered through introspection. Let me walk you through what neuroscientists have found. Thomas Metzinger, philosopher and cognitive scientist at Johannes Gutenberg University, spent decades researching the neural basis of consciousness and self-awareness. His conclusion, published in The Ego Tunnel, mirrors Buddhist teaching with startling precision. There is no thing corresponding to the word I. The self is not an entity but a process. Specifically, it's what Metzinger calls the phenomenal self-model, a continuously updated representation your brain creates to navigate the world. This model feels utterly real and convincing because evolution designed it that way. An organism that questions whether it exists every few seconds wouldn't survive long. But feeling real doesn't make it real in the way we assume. Your brain constructs a unified sense of self from disparate neural processes, the same way it constructs the visual field from signals coming through your eyes. The construction is so seamless that you never notice it's happening. Consider the neuroscience of decision-making, an area where ego dissolution becomes particularly evident. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s revealed something disturbing to anyone who believes in conscious free will. When subjects were asked to make a spontaneous decision to move their hand, brain activity associated with that movement began 350 milliseconds before the subject reported consciously deciding to move. The brain initiated the action before the conscious mind registered any intention. More recent studies using fMRI technology have pushed this timing back even further. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute can predict with reasonable accuracy which decision you'll make up to 7 seconds before you consciously experience making that choice. So who is deciding? If the conscious self isn't the author of its own actions, what exactly is this ego we defend so fiercely? Buddhist philosophy, particularly as elaborated by Nagarjuna in the Madhyamaka tradition, addresses this with the concept of dependent origination. Nothing exists independently. Everything arises based on causes and conditions. The self you experience right now depends on your body, your memories, your current sensory input, your emotional state, your beliefs, your social context, and countless other factors, all of which are themselves dependently arisen and constantly changing. Tsongkhapa, in his commentary on Madhyamaka philosophy, emphasized that understanding emptiness doesn't mean things don't exist at all. It means they don't exist in the way we habitually assume, as solid, independent, permanent entities. The self exists as a conventional designation, a useful fiction, but has no inherent reality separate from the processes that constitute it. This is precisely what neuroscience now confirms through completely different methods. If this is challenging everything you thought you knew about yourself, leave a comment sharing your reaction. These insights become clearer through dialogue and reflection. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on external tasks, provides particularly compelling evidence. This network, discovered by Marcus Rachel and colleagues, includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus. It activates during self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory retrieval, imagining the future and thinking about others' mental states. Essentially, it's the neural correlate of the ego, the me generator. Here's what's fascinating. Experienced meditators show significantly reduced default mode network activity during meditation. Judson Brewer's research at Yale demonstrated that mindfulness meditation practitioners, even when not formally meditating, showed different default mode network patterns than non-meditators. The constant self-referential chatter, the narrative loop of me and my story, quiets down. The brain stops compulsively generating the sense of a separate self. Pema Chodron teaches that ego is not the enemy to be destroyed, but a misunderstanding to be seen through. This is crucial because many people, when they first encounter Buddhist no-self teaching or neuroscientific evidence against a unified ego, react with existential panic. If there's no real me, then what's the point of anything? Why be moral? Why care about anything? This reaction reveals how deeply confused we are about the nature of self. Compassion, love, ethical behavior. These don't require a permanent, unchanging soul. They arise naturally when you see clearly how interconnected everything is, how your well-being and others' well-being are not separate. The relief of ego dissolution is that you no longer have to defend and maintain a fictional construct, the neurotic self-consciousness that monitors every social interaction, that compares yourself to others, that creates anxiety about past and future. That voice isn't your true nature. It's a habit pattern, and habits can change. The neuroscience of meditation provides a practical bridge between ancient contemplative wisdom and modern understanding. Richard Davidson's research at the University of Wisconsin has mapped how different meditation practices affect brain structure and function. Loving-kindness meditation increases activity in brain regions associated with empathy and emotional processing. Attention-focused meditation strengthens neural networks involved in executive control and reduces mind wandering. Open monitoring meditation, similar to Dzogchen practices described by Longchen Rabjam, shows a fascinating pattern where the distinction between observer and observed begins to dissolve at the neural level. The brain's usual subject-object organization of experience becomes less rigid. This isn't mystical unity consciousness divorced from neurobiology. It's a specific, measurable shift in how neural networks organize information. Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, who has spent hundreds of hours in brain scanners helping scientists study meditation, bridges traditional Buddhist training and neuroscientific investigation in a unique way. He explains that when you meditate on the nature of mind, you're not trying to achieve some special state. You're recognizing what's always already present, awareness itself. Not the content of awareness, not the thoughts, emotions, sensations, or sense of self that appear in awareness, but the knowing quality that makes any experience possible. Neuroscience can measure correlates of this recognition, changes in brain activity when meditators rest in open awareness. But the experience itself is first-person, direct, immediate. The laboratory equipment confirms what contemplatives report, but can't replace the actual practice of looking at mind directly. Here's where Buddhist philosophy becomes profoundly practical rather than abstract. The teaching on no-self isn't asking you to believe something counterintuitive. It's inviting you to investigate your actual experience. Right now, can you find this solid self you assume exists? When you look for the I that you think is having experiences, what do you actually find? You find thoughts about yourself, memories, sensations in your body, perhaps a feeling of existence. But can you locate the thing itself, the entity that owns all these experiences? The more closely you look, the more this solid self seems to dissolve into processes. Thoughts thinking themselves, sensations arising and passing. Awareness aware of contents, but is the awareness itself a thing, an entity, or is it more like space, the openness in which everything appears? Click the like button if you're seeing how neuroscience and Buddhism converge on this radical insight about selfhood. The rubber hand illusion demonstrates how malleable our sense of self actually is. In this experiment, researchers hide your real hand and place a rubber hand visible in front of you. They then stroke both the rubber hand and your hidden real hand simultaneously. Within minutes, most people begin to feel the stroking sensations as coming from the rubber hand. They've incorporated a piece of rubber into their body image. When researchers threaten the rubber hand with a hammer, subjects show stress responses, increased heart rate, and skin conductance, defending a fake hand as if it were part of themselves. This isn't a party trick. It reveals that your sense of where you end and the world begins is not based on some inherent truth, but on the brain's best guess given available information. Your body image, and by extension your sense of self, is a constantly updated hypothesis. Out-of-body experiences and altered states of consciousness provide even more dramatic evidence. Olaf Blanke's research using direct brain stimulation found that activating the temporoparietal junction can induce the sensation of floating above your body, seeing yourself from an external perspective. The sense of being located in your body, which feels like the most obvious and indubitable fact of existence, can be disrupted by altering activity in specific brain regions. People who have near-death experiences often report watching themselves from above, seeing the room, the medical team, the body on the table. While interpretations of these experiences vary wildly, the neuroscience is clear. Your sense of self-location is constructed by your brain and can be deconstructed when normal neural processing is disrupted. The Buddhist teaching that self is a fabrication becomes experientially obvious in these moments. Shantideva wrote in the Bodhicharyavatara that all fear and suffering stem from grasping at a self that doesn't exist and defending it against threats. When neuroscience reveals that this self is a neural construction, a model generated for evolutionary advantage rather than a metaphysical reality, what happens to all that fear? The anxiety about your identity, your reputation, your achievements, your failures, all of it rests on a case of mistaken identity. You've confused the character in the story for the awareness that knows the story. This confusion isn't a personal failing. It's how the brain evolved to function. But it's not inevitable. Meditation training, philosophical investigation, and direct examination of experience can reveal the constructed nature of ego and open up a completely different relationship with being alive. Let's address a common confusion. When Buddhism teaches no self and neuroscience confirms the ego is a construction, this doesn't mean you should become passive or nihilistic. It doesn't mean there's no continuity of experience or that ethical behavior doesn't matter. What it means is that the solid, permanent, independent self you've been defending and promoting doesn't exist in the way you thought. There's still a conventional self, a functional organism moving through the world, learning, growing, interacting. But that conventional self is a process, not a thing. It's more like a verb than a noun. When you stop trying to maintain and defend a fictional entity, enormous energy becomes available for actually living. The self-consciousness that monitors everything, the internal critic, the constant comparison with others, all that exhausting mental activity can relax. The neuroscience of psychedelics adds another dimension to this conversation. Robin Carhart Harris's research at Imperial College London, using fMRI scans of people on psilocybin, showed decreased activity in the default mode network and decreased connectivity between brain regions that normally communicate frequently. Subjects reported ego dissolution, a sense of boundaries dissolving, unity with everything. This wasn't mere hallucination. The brain's usual pattern of self-construction was temporarily disrupted. Similarly, experienced meditators report states where the sense of separate self dissolves, and there's just experience happening without an experiencer. Different methods, meditation and psychedelics, similar phenomenology, and similar neural signatures. Both validate what Buddhist masters have taught. The ego is not your essential nature, but a habit pattern that can be interrupted. Stay with me because we're approaching the most liberating implications of this understanding. If the self is a process rather than an entity, then change becomes not just possible but inevitable. You are not stuck being who you've been. The narrative you tell about yourself, the personality you've constructed, the limitations you assume are inherent, all of it is fluid. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself throughout life, is the biological foundation for Buddhist teachings on transformation. The brain you have today is different from the brain you had a year ago, shaped by your experiences, your attention patterns, your behaviors. Every moment of meditation strengthens neural networks associated with attention and awareness. Every moment of compassion practice activates brain regions involved in empathy. You are literally constructing yourself moment by moment through where you place your attention. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has engaged extensively with neuroscientists through the Mind and Life Institute dialogues, bringing Buddhist contemplative wisdom into conversation with cognitive science. He emphasizes that Buddhism is fundamentally empirical. The Buddha didn't ask anyone to believe his teachings on faith. He said, investigate for yourself. Test these ideas in the laboratory of your own experience. If they don't hold up, discard them. Modern neuroscience provides an external verification of what meditation practitioners have discovered internally. The convergence is striking not because Buddhism predicted neuroscience, but because both are investigating the same reality, consciousness, and the nature of self, using different but complementary methods. One uses brain scanners and controlled experiments. The other uses sustained introspective attention, but both arrive at similar conclusions about the constructed nature of ego. The implications extend into psychotherapy and mental health treatment. Traditional cognitive behavioral therapy already recognizes that thoughts are not facts, that the stories you tell yourself about who you are can be questioned and changed. Acceptance and commitment therapy explicitly teaches psychological flexibility, the ability to be present with your experience without being dominated by conceptual self-stories. Mindfulness-based interventions, now mainstream in clinical psychology, derive directly from Buddhist meditation practices and work, precisely by helping people disidentify from thoughts and emotions. Instead of "I am anxious," and you learn to recognize anxiety as present. This small shift in language reflects a profound shift in relationship to experience. You stop being the anxiety and become the awareness that knows anxiety has arisen. Neuroscience reveals why this helps. You're engaging different neural networks, moving from default mode self-referential processing to present moment awareness. Consider how much suffering in your life comes from defending and promoting a self-image. The anxiety about what others think of you, the shame when you fail to meet your own standards, the pride when you succeed, the comparison with others, the need to be right, the fear of being exposed as inadequate. All of this exhausting psychological activity serves a fictional entity. When you see clearly that there's no solid self to defend, what remains? Just life happening, experiences arising, responses emerging, awareness knowing it all. This isn't cold or impersonal. Actually, it's the opposite. When you're not constantly filtering everything through, "How does this affect me?" you become genuinely available to life as it is, to others as they are, to the present moment in its fullness. Compassion arises naturally, because the artificial boundary between self and other has been seen through. The practice implications are straightforward. You don't need to believe in no self as a metaphysical doctrine. You just need to investigate, sit in meditation and look for the self. Watch thoughts arise and ask, who is thinking? Watch sensations appear and ask, who is feeling? Watch awareness itself and ask, is this awareness a thing, an entity, or is it more like open space? The looking itself begins to shift your relationship with experience. Between the Buddhist teaching, the neuroscientific evidence, and your own direct investigation, a transformation becomes possible that isn't based on belief or wishful thinking, but on clear seeing. Which aspect of ego dissolution feels most relevant to your life right now? Share in the comments. Your questions help clarify these teachings for everyone. Thupten Jinpa, in his role bridging traditional Tibetan Buddhism and contemporary Western understanding, points out that the teaching on selflessness must be balanced with compassion. You can intellectually understand that the self is empty and use that as spiritual bypass, avoiding genuine relationship and responsibility. But authentic realization of no self doesn't lead to detachment in the sense of not caring. It leads to engagement free from neurotic self-concern. You care deeply about others precisely because you see there's no fundamental separation. The boundaries are conventional, useful for navigating daily life, but not ultimately real. This is why Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes bodhicitta, the awakened heart that seeks enlightenment not for oneself alone but for all beings. When you realize there is no separate self, the distinction between your liberation and others' liberation dissolves. Let's look at practical exercises that work with this understanding. Throughout your day, pause periodically and ask yourself, where am I right now? Not where is your body located, but can you find the I that seems to be having this experience? You'll probably notice thoughts about yourself, sensations, perceptions, but try to locate the actual entity you call me. This simple inquiry, repeated consistently, begins to loosen the sense of solid selfhood. Notice when you're defending your self-image, when you're promoting yourself, when you're worried about what others think. In those moments, ask who is being defended, who is being promoted, what exactly am I protecting? You're not trying to get rid of ego through force. You're investigating whether it actually exists as you've assumed. Another powerful practice comes from Dzogchen tradition, as taught by masters like Longchen Rabjam. Simply rest in awareness itself without trying to change or fix anything. Don't follow thoughts into stories about past and future. Don't identify with emotions as they arise and pass. Just remain as the knowing quality that's aware of everything. At first, this might last only moments before you're swept back into identification with mental content. That's fine. Each moment of recognition, of resting as awareness rather than as the constructed self, rewires neural patterns. Neuroscience shows that even brief periods of meditation create measurable changes in brain structure and function. You're not trying to achieve some exotic altered state. You're recognizing what's already here underneath the constant self-construction. The cultural implications of ego dissolution are profound and largely unexplored in modern society. Western civilization is built on assumptions of individual autonomy, permanent identity, the self as the fundamental unit of moral and legal consideration. Much of this is useful for organizing society. But we've confused conventional truth with ultimate truth. We've reified the self into an absolute. The result is epidemic levels of narcissism, isolation, anxiety, and depression. People feel fundamentally alone, trapped inside a separate self, unable to genuinely connect. The neuroscientific evidence that self is a construction, combined with contemplative wisdom that's tested this for centuries, offers a way forward. Not by destroying individuality, but by holding it lightly, recognizing it as a useful fiction rather than ultimate reality. What you've encountered today is not just interesting information. It's an invitation to investigate the most fundamental assumption you make every moment of every day, that you are a solid, separate, continuing self. Buddhist philosophy deconstructs this assumption through logic and meditation. Neuroscience deconstructs it through empirical measurement of brain activity. Your own direct experience, when examined carefully, reveals the same truth. The self you've been defending doesn't exist in the way you think it does. This isn't bad news. It's liberation. When the fictional self relaxes, what remains is simply being aware, alive, responsive, connected, and fundamentally free from the neurotic self-concern that creates so much suffering. The path is clear. The evidence is compelling. The invitation stands. Will you investigate? What's your biggest question about the relationship between neuroscience and Buddhist teachings on no self? Drop it in the comments and let's explore this together. If you haven't subscribed, do it now because we're just beginning this journey into the nature of mind and reality. Share this video with anyone trapped in the exhausting project of defending and maintaining an ego that neuroscience proves doesn't exist. The truth will set you free, but first it might disturb your entire sense of reality. That disturbance is the beginning of awakening.